Most people believe they understand why the American Civil War happened. Ask almost anyone, and you will probably get a neat, straightforward answer: slavery. The North wanted to end it. The South wanted to keep it. They fought. The good guys won. End of story. But there is a serious problem with that version of events. It is not exactly wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete. And when you strip away the simplified textbook narrative and actually follow the money, the politics, the backroom deals, and the decades of escalating brinksmanship that led to the bloodiest conflict in American history, you discover something far more unsettling. The Civil War was not simply a moral crusade against an evil institution. It was also the violent culmination of an economic Cold War that had been building for nearly half a century. A collision between two fundamentally incompatible systems of wealth creation, two visions of what America was supposed to become, and two ruling classes who understood, perhaps better than anyone, that whoever controlled the future of the Western territories would control the future of the nation itself. Before going any further, I want to make one point absolutely clear. Slavery stood at the very center of this conflict. It formed the foundation on which the Southern economy had been constructed. It was the moral catastrophe that defined the era, and the roughly 4 million human beings held in bondage in 1860 were not abstractions or economic units. They were people, real people whose suffering and resistance is one of the most important stories in all of human history. Nothing in this video should be understood as minimizing that reality. But what historians increasingly argue, and what I think most people never learned, is that slavery was more than a labor system. It also functioned as a financial instrument. It was a currency. It was a source of collateral, of credit, of political power, and of international leverage. And to understand why 620,000 Americans killed each other between 1861 and 1865, you need to understand how deeply slavery was woven into the financial architecture of the entire nation, not just the South, but the North, Wall Street, the banks of London, the cotton mills of Manchester, and the railroad boardrooms of Chicago. So let us go back. Not to the first shots fired at Fort Sumter, but to where this story really begins decades earlier, in a world where the seeds of war were planted not on battlefields, but in congressional chambers, tariff negotiations, and the ledgers of the most powerful banks on earth. Let's start with something that most Americans never learn in school, and that's the Tariff of Abominations. In 1828, the United States Congress passed one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in the young nation's history, officially known as the Tariff of 1828, but quickly dubbed the Tariff of Abominations by its Southern critics. On its face, it was a trade policy. It imposed enormous duties on imported manufactured goods, sometimes pushing rates close to 50%. The stated purpose was to protect the growing factories and manufacturing operations in the northern states, places like New England and the mid-Atlantic, from being undercut by cheap British imports. But here is the part textbooks often pass over too quickly. This tariff did more than simply protect northern industry. It was, in effect, an economic weapon aimed squarely at the South. The southern states at this time were overwhelmingly agricultural. Their economy revolved around cash crops, primarily cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar, all of which depended on trade with Europe, and especially with Great Britain. Southern planters exported their raw materials to British mills and factories, and in return they imported British manufactured goods, everything from clothing to tools to machinery. The economic relationship was deeply interdependent. Britain needed Southern cotton to feed its industrial revolution. The South needed British goods because the region had almost no manufacturing base of its own. So, when Northern politicians pushed through a tariff that dramatically raised the cost of those British imports, the South saw it for exactly what it was: a wealth transfer. Northern factories benefited from reduced competition. Southern planters paid the price through inflated costs on the goods they needed to buy. And even worse, the South feared that Britain might retaliate with its own tariffs on American commodities, which would devastate the cotton. The reaction was explosive. South Carolina, led by Vice President John C. Calhoun, didn't just oppose the tariff. They developed an entirely new constitutional theory to fight it. Calhoun anonymously authored a document called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he laid out the doctrine of nullification, the idea that a state had the sovereign right to declare any federal law it deemed unconstitutional to be null and void within its borders. Consider the significance of that for a moment. 3 decades before the first shot of the Civil War was fired, a sitting Vice President of the United States was crafting the legal and philosophical framework for secession, and he wasn't doing it over slavery directly. He was doing it over a tax dispute. Of course, the tariff dispute and slavery were deeply intertwined. The reason the South had no manufacturing was because its entire economic model was built on plantation agriculture powered by enslaved labor. The reason the South was so dependent on British trade was because that agricultural model produced raw materials, not finished goods. So, when you pull on the thread of the tariff, you inevitably arrive at slavery. But the point is that the political mechanism, the actual constitutional crisis that nearly tore the country apart 30 years before the Civil War, wasn't framed as a debate about the morality of human bondage. It was framed as a debate about economic sovereignty, about states' rights, and about whether the federal government had the authority to impose policies that systematically enriched one region at the expense of another. The nullification crisis of 1832 pushed the country dangerously close to the brink. South Carolina formally adopted an ordinance of nullification, declaring both the 1828 and 1832 tariffs void within its borders, and explicitly threatening to secede from the Union if the federal government tried to enforce them. President Andrew Jackson, to his credit, responded with the Force Bill, authorizing the use of military power to collect the tariffs. For a brief, terrifying moment, the United States was staring at civil war. A compromise tariff hammered out by Henry Clay in 1833 pulled the nation back from the edge. But the damage was done. The precedent had been set. A southern state had openly threatened to leave the Union, and the federal government had been forced to negotiate rather than simply enforce its laws. Secession was no longer merely a theoretical idea. It was a loaded weapon sitting on the table waiting to be picked up again. And this is the first thing historians often get wrong, or at least the first thing most popular accounts of the Civil War failed to adequately address. They treat secession as if it sprang fully formed from the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. But the truth is that secession had been rehearsed, debated, and nearly executed decades earlier. The nullification crisis effectively became a rehearsal for what would happen in 1861. The scripts were written, the arguments polished, the constitutional theories developed. The only question was what event would finally trigger the actual performance. Now, to understand why the stakes were so impossibly high, you need to understand something about slavery that most people don't fully grasp. And it's this. By 1860, enslaved human beings were the single most valuable financial asset in the entire United States. Not cotton, not land, not railroads, or factories or banks. People. The roughly 4 million men, women, and children held in bondage were collectively valued at approximately $5 billion in 1860 currency. To put that in perspective, the figure was greater than the combined value of every railroad, every factory, and every bank in the entire country. It was roughly 20% of the nation's total wealth. In today's dollars, we're talking about something in the range of $13 trillion or more. Consider what that means for a moment. We often think of slavery in moral terms, as we should. But the slaveholding class of the American South wasn't just defending a social institution. They were defending the largest concentration of capital in the Western Hemisphere. They were also defending an enormous concentration of wealth on their balance sheets. And this is where the story gets really dark, because it wasn't just Southern planters whose wealth was tied to the system, Northern banks, Northern insurance companies, Northern shipping firms and northern textile manufacturers were all deeply, inextricably entangled in the economics of slavery. Consider what was happening on Wall Street in the decades before the war. The cotton trade was the engine that powered the American economy. By 1860, cotton accounted for roughly 60% of all American exports. The raw material was grown in the South by enslaved laborers, but it was shipped by northern merchants, financed by northern banks, insured by northern underwriters, and sold through northern commodity exchanges before being loaded onto ships bound for Liverpool and Manchester. The entire supply chain, from the plantation to the textile mill, was a transatlantic financial network. And every link in that chain was lubricated by the labor of enslaved people. Some of the most prominent banks in American history were built on this foundation. The predecessors of institutions that still exist today, including the Citibank of New York, which would eventually become Citibank, conducted enormous volumes of business that flowed directly from the slave economy. Northern financiers shipped cotton northward, converted agricultural wealth into cash, and then reinvested the proceeds into northern industrial development, into railroad construction, into real estate, into corporate stocks. The wealth created by enslaved labor in the cotton fields of Mississippi and Alabama didn't stay in the South. It flowed upward and outward into the vaults of Wall Street and the coffers of northern industry. And it wasn't just domestic. British merchant banking houses extended lines of credit to southern planters, effectively bankrolling the expansion of slavery across the Deep South. Banks in London and Liverpool financed the purchase of land and enslaved people in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Southern banks, for their part, developed entirely new financial practices to accommodate the slave economy. They accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. They created mortgage instruments backed by human property. In Louisiana alone, one bank, the Citizens Bank, held mortgages on nearly 9% of all enslaved workers in the state's most productive sugar parishes. This was not merely a regional system. It was national in scope and, in fact, international. And when abolitionists began gaining political traction in the 1840s and 1850s, what terrified the Southern elite wasn't just the moral argument against slavery. It was the prospect of having $3.5 billion in assets evaporated overnight. Imagine someone proposing to eliminate 20% of the nation's wealth with a stroke of a pen. That's essentially what abolition represented in economic terms. And the people who controlled the wealth were not going to surrender it without a fight. Now here's where the story takes another turn that most popular histories either skip or compress into a single paragraph. The fight over slavery in the decades before the war was not primarily about abolishing slavery where it already existed. It was about controlling its expansion into the Western territories. And this is the second crucial thing that gets oversimplified or misunderstood. The Founding Fathers, for all their contradictions, had established a fragile equilibrium. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 drew a line across the map at the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. Slavery would be permitted south of that line in the Louisiana territories and prohibited north of it, with Missouri itself admitted as a slave state to balance Maine's admission as a free state. It was an imperfect, morally compromised solution, but it held for over 3 decades because it maintained the political balance of power in the United States Senate, where every slave state had its counterpart in a free state. That balance was politically crucial. It was the keystone of the entire political architecture of the antebellum republic, because as long as the number of slave states and free states remained equal, the South could block any legislation it found threatening. It could prevent tariffs from being raised too high. It could prevent federal funding from being directed exclusively to northern infrastructure. And most importantly, it could prevent Congress from ever passing a law that touched the institution of slavery itself. But westward expansion was relentlessly destabilizing this equilibrium. Every new territory that was organized, every new state that applied for admission, triggered a crisis. Would each new territory enter as free or slave? The answer to that question didn't just determine the fate of that territory, it determined the balance of power in Washington. It determined who would control the Senate, and by extension, who would control the federal government. The Compromise of 1850 was the next attempt to manage this pressure. California was admitted as a free state, but the territories of New Mexico and Utah were organized under the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers themselves would decide whether to permit slavery. The compromise also included a dramatically strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, which required northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their owners and imposed severe penalties on anyone who aided them. This provision was meant to reassure the South that the North would respect slave property, but it had the opposite effect. It enraged Northern public opinion, turned ordinary citizens into reluctant participants in the slave system, and radicalized people who had previously been indifferent to the abolitionist cause. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and this is where the entire system began to unravel. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, who was championing the construction of a transcontinental railroad with its eastern terminus in Chicago, needed Southern votes to organize the Nebraska territory through which the railroad would pass. To get those votes, he offered the South something extraordinary. He proposed repealing the Missouri Compromise entirely and applying popular sovereignty to the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska, both of which were north of the 3630 line and should have been permanently closed to slavery. Repealing the Missouri Compromise produced a political earthquake. It shattered the fragile peace that had held for 34 years. Northern opponents of slavery were incandescent with rage. The Whig Party, which had been one of the two major political parties in the country, essentially collapsed. And from its ashes rose the Republican Party, a new political force organized around a single principle, the containment of slavery. Importantly, the initial principle was containment, not immediate abolition. The early Republicans didn't campaign on freeing the enslaved. They campaigned on preventing slavery from spreading into the territories. That distinction is enormously important. And it's the third thing that popular history tends to get wrong. Abraham Lincoln, the man who would become the great emancipator, did not run for president in 1860 on a platform of abolishing slavery. He ran on a platform of preventing its expansion. In his famous debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Lincoln made his position clear. He believed slavery was morally wrong. He opposed its spread into the territories, but he explicitly stated that he had no intention and no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery where it already existed. By the standards of the period, this was not a radical abolitionist position. It was, by the standards of the time, a moderate one. But to the Southern slaveholding class, even containment was an existential threat. The reason was structural. The cotton economy was inherently expansionist. The intensive cultivation of cotton rapidly depleted the soil. After a few years, a cotton plantation would begin to see declining yields, and the planter would need new land to maintain production. This is why slavery had spread so aggressively westward throughout the first half of the 19th century, from the original tobacco-growing regions of Virginia and the Carolinas into the deep South, into the rich bottomlands of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and eventually into Texas. If slavery could not expand into the western territories, it would eventually be hemmed in, surrounded by free states, and slowly strangled economically. Beyond economics, expansion was fundamentally a question of political power. If the territories were organized as free states, the South would lose its balance in the Senate. It would become a permanent political minority. A Northern-dominated Congress could then pass tariffs, fund Northern infrastructure, and eventually, perhaps inevitably, move against slavery itself. For the South, containment didn't mean coexistence. It meant slow-motion extinction, and the slaveholding class was not prepared to accept that fate. The violence did not wait until 1861. It erupted in Kansas almost immediately the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed. Pro-slavery settlers from Missouri, known as border ruffians, crossed into Kansas to stuff ballot boxes and intimidate free state settlers. Anti-slavery immigrants from New England, organized by groups like the New England Emigrant Aid Company, flooded into the territory to counter them. Between 1855 and 1859, the territory descended into a guerrilla war. Pro-slavery forces sacked the town of Lawrence. The abolitionist John Brown retaliated with the Potawatomi Massacre, personally leading a group that hacked 5 pro-slavery settlers to death with broadswords. Rival territorial legislatures were established. Armed militias roamed the countryside. The period became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it was, in every meaningful sense, the opening act of the Civil War. What was happening in Kansas was a proxy war, a preview of the larger conflict to come. It demonstrated that the question of slavery's expansion could not be resolved through legislation or compromise. It could only be resolved through force, and both sides were beginning to understand this. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court intensified the crisis dramatically. In 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney handed down the Dred Scott decision, one of the most infamous rulings in the court's history. The case involved Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner into free territories and sued for his freedom on the grounds that his residence in free territory had made him free. Taney's ruling was sweeping and devastating. He declared that black Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens of the United States and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. He further ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively declaring the Missouri Compromise and all similar legislation unconstitutional, and he asserted that enslaved people were property protected by the Fifth Amendment, and could be taken anywhere in the United States without losing their enslaved status. The Dred Scott decision did far more than rule against a single man. It demolished the legal foundation of the containment strategy. If Congress couldn't ban slavery in the territories, then the Republican Party's entire platform was unconstitutional. The ruling was a gift to the South, but it was also a provocation that pushed the North toward a more radical position. If the legal system wouldn't contain slavery, then perhaps only political power could. And if political power failed, then perhaps only violence remained. By 1859, the country was a powder keg. John Brown, the same man who had led the Potawatomi Massacre in Kansas, launched his audacious raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the intention of arming enslaved people and sparking a massive slave rebellion across the South. The raid itself failed. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But his actions terrified the South beyond anything that had come before. Here was a white man, funded by Northern abolitionists, who had attempted to incite a violent insurrection. In Southern eyes, this was proof that the North was no longer content with containment. They wanted destruction. Brown's execution transformed him into a martyr in the North. Church bells rang. Poets wrote elegies. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a new saint who would make the gallows glorious like the cross. To the South, the Northern reaction to Brown's raid was even more alarming than the raid itself. It suggested that a significant portion of Northern society endorsed violent action against slavery. The trust between North and South, already fractured, was now shattered beyond repair. That brings us to 1860 and the election of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln won with just under 40% of the popular vote. He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. His victory was entirely a Northern phenomenon, proof to the South that a president could be elected without a single Southern vote. For Southern leaders, the implications were alarming. If the North could control the presidency without the South, then the South had already lost the political war. Containment was no longer merely a future threat. It was the present reality. South Carolina seceded on December 20th, 1860, 6 weeks after Lincoln's election, and 3 months before he even took office. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed within weeks. By February of 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. Now, if you read the Secession declarations, and I encourage everyone to do this because they are remarkably revealing documents, you will find something that completely demolishes the myth that the war was primarily about states' rights in some abstract constitutional sense. The declarations are explicit. They name slavery by name over and over again as the cause of secession. Mississippi's declaration states plainly that their position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery and calls it the greatest material interest of the world. Georgia's declaration details a long list of grievances related to slavery in the territories. South Carolina's declaration focuses on the failure of northern states to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act and the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Texas complains that the federal government has failed to protect slave property on the frontier. These documents are not ambiguous on this point. They are not abstract meditations on constitutional theory. They are declarations of economic and political war, and the word slavery appears in them again and again. The idea that the war was about states' rights rather than slavery is a post-war invention, a creation of the lost cause mythology that emerged in the decades after the Confederacy's defeat. The actual leaders of the Confederacy had no difficulty articulating exactly what they were fighting for. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, made this staggeringly explicit in his infamous cornerstone speech of March 1861, in which he declared that the Confederacy's foundations were laid upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This leads to an important paradox, and this is what I think historians get wrong, or at least what they fail to communicate clearly enough. It was all about slavery, and it was also about much more than slavery. Those two statements do not contradict one another. They describe different layers of the same conflict. Slavery was the central issue, but it was the central issue because it was embedded in everything else, in trade policy, in banking, in territorial expansion, in constitutional theory, in international relations, in the very structure of American capitalism. You cannot separate slavery from the tariff debates. You cannot separate it from the railroad question. You cannot separate it from Wall Street or London or the cotton mills of Lancashire. Slavery wasn't just one issue among many. It was the lens through which every other issue was refracted. And this brings us to another dimension of the story that most accounts underplay, and that is the international context. The American Civil War was not exclusively a domestic affair. It was a global event with global implications because the American cotton economy was the beating heart of the international industrial system. By the late 1850s, Great Britain imported roughly 78% of its cotton from the American South. Cotton was the raw material that powered the British textile industry, which was itself the engine of the world's largest and most powerful economy. The mill towns of Lancashire, cities like Manchester and Liverpool, were utterly dependent on a steady flow of southern cotton. Hundreds of thousands of British workers owed their livelihoods to the continued operation of the American plantation system, and the financial connections ran even deeper. British merchant banking houses provided the credit that fueled the expansion of the cotton frontier. They advanced money to southern factors and commission agents, who then loaned it to planters for land and enslaved people. The cotton trade was the single most important thread in the web of transatlantic finance. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate leadership understood this dependency and tried to weaponize it. Their strategy, known as King Cotton diplomacy, was based on a simple but powerful premise. If the South withheld its cotton, Britain's textile industry would collapse. Hundreds of thousands of workers would be thrown out of work, and the resulting economic and political pressure would force the British government to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation, break the Union blockade, and perhaps even intervene militarily on the South's behalf. It was an extraordinarily bold gamble, and for a time it seemed like it might work. The cotton famine that hit Lancashire in 1862 caused genuine suffering. Mills closed, workers starved. Delegations of cotton merchants and manufacturers descended on London and Paris, pleading with their governments to recognize the Confederacy and bring the blockade to an end. In France, Napoleon III was openly sympathetic to the Confederate cause and desperate to restore the flow of cotton. British leaders, particularly those with economic ties to the South, were tempted. But the gamble ultimately failed for several crucial reasons. First, the South had produced bumper crops in the 2 years before the war, allowing Britain and France to stockpile surpluses that cushioned them from the initial shock. Second, British manufacturers began diversifying their cotton sources, importing from Egypt, India, and Brazil. Third, and perhaps most importantly, British public opinion was deeply opposed to slavery. The British working class, despite their suffering during the cotton famine, largely supported the Union cause. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863 was a masterstroke of international diplomacy, because it reframed the war in explicitly moral terms. Once the war was officially about ending slavery, no European government could openly support the Confederacy without appearing to endorse human bondage. Britain, which had abolished slavery in its own empire in 1833, could not be seen siding with slaveholders, no matter how much its textile industry needed their cotton. There is another dimension that deserves greater attention. The British had strategic concerns beyond cotton. They knew that a war with the Union would mean an invasion of Canada, the destruction of the British merchant fleet, and the disruption of food imports from the American North, which had become increasingly important. The calculus wasn't just about cotton versus morality. It was about the full spectrum of British strategic interests. And when all factors were weighed, intervention on behalf of the Confederacy was simply too risky. France, under Napoleon III, was more sympathetic, but unwilling to act without British support. And France had its own concerns, particularly the growing threat from Prussia on the continent. Without Britain's cooperation, French intervention was off the table. What the international dimension reveals is that the Civil War was, at its core, a crisis of the global capitalist system. The cotton economy linked the American South to the factories of Europe, the banks of London, and the merchant houses of New York in a web of mutual dependency. When that web was torn apart by secession and war, the shockwaves rippled across the Atlantic. The Civil War wasn't just an American event, it was a global reckoning with the contradictions of an economic system built on enslaved labor. Let me now talk about something else that often gets lost in the standard telling, and that's the role of the border states. When we think of the Civil War, we tend to imagine a clean geographic split, the North versus the South. The actual geographic and political situation was much messier. 4 slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, remained in the Union despite permitting slavery within their borders. Lincoln understood that losing these states would be catastrophic. Kentucky alone controlled the Ohio River, a vital transportation artery. Maryland surrounded Washington, D.C., on 3 sides. If Maryland seceded, the national capital would be an island in Confederate territory. Lincoln's management of the border states reveals something important about the true nature of the conflict. He couldn't frame the war as a crusade against slavery, because doing so would push the border states into the Confederacy. For the first 18 months of the war, Lincoln's official position was that the war was being fought to preserve the Union, not to free the enslaved. When General John Fremont issued an emancipation order in Missouri in 1861, Lincoln revoked it. When General David Hunter freed enslaved people in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, Lincoln overruled him, too. The president was walking a razor's edge, fighting a war caused by slavery while publicly insisting that the war wasn't about slavery because admitting the truth would cost him the border states and possibly the war itself. The situation was deeply ironic, and it's another thing that the simplified narrative obscures. The war was absolutely about slavery. The Confederacy said so explicitly, but the Union initially couldn't say so because its own coalition included slave-holding states. The proclamation, when it finally came in January 1863, was a carefully calibrated document. It freed the enslaved only in Confederate-held territory where Lincoln had no actual authority to enforce it. It explicitly exempted the border states and Union-occupied areas of the South. It was a war measure designed to undermine the Confederate economy and open the door for black military service, as much as it was a moral statement. None of these political constraints diminished the proclamation's significance. It fundamentally transformed the character of the war. It made abolition a Union war aim. It paved the way for the 13th Amendment, and it made clear that there would be no negotiated peace that preserved slavery. But understanding the political constraints under which it was issued helps us see the full complexity of the conflict. The Civil War cannot be reduced to a simple morality play. It was a political, economic, and military crisis of extraordinary complexity in which moral imperatives were constantly entangled with strategic calculations. Now, let me pull back and talk about the deeper structural forces that made war essentially inevitable, because I think the most important thing historians get wrong isn't any single factor event. It's the framing. They present the war as if it could have been avoided, as if some better compromise, some wiser leadership, some more moderate course of action could have prevented 620,000 deaths. But when you look at the structural dynamics, the war appears less like a failure of diplomacy and more like the inevitable result of an irreconcilable economic contradiction. The United States in the first half of the 19th century was really two countries sharing a single government. The North was industrializing rapidly. It was building factories, railroads, and canals. It was attracting waves of European immigrants who provided cheap labor for its growing manufacturing sector. Its economy was diversifying, modernizing, and urbanizing. The South, by contrast, was locked into a monoculture agricultural model built on enslaved labor. It produced raw materials for export, but manufactured almost nothing. It had fewer railroads, fewer factories, fewer schools, and fewer cities. Its wealth was concentrated in the hands of a small planter aristocracy whose power rested entirely on the continued existence of slavery. These two economic systems had fundamentally different needs from the federal government. The North wanted high tariffs to protect its infant industries. The South wanted low tariffs to keep the cost of imported goods down. The North wanted federal investment in infrastructure, roads, canals, and railroads that would connect its growing industrial network. The South was suspicious of federal spending that didn't directly benefit its agricultural economy. The North wanted a national banking system that could provide stable credit for industrial expansion. The South preferred a looser, decentralized financial system that left more power in the hands of state banks. And underneath all of these policy disagreements was the fundamental question of slavery's expansion. The North understood that if slavery spread into the Western territories, those territories would develop along Southern lines as agricultural economies producing raw materials with enslaved labor. They would become allies of the South in Congress, tipping the balance of power permanently. The South understood that if the territories were close to slavery, they would develop along northern lines as free labor economies oriented toward manufacturing and commerce. They would become allies of the North, and the South would be marginalized. This was more than an ordinary political rivalry. It was an existential struggle between two incompatible civilizations. And the tragedy of the antebellum period is that every attempt at compromise only delayed the reckoning without resolving the underlying contradiction. The Missouri Compromise bought 34 years. The Compromise of 1850 bought a decade. The Kansas-Nebraska Act didn't even buy a year before violence erupted. Each compromise was weaker than the last because the fundamental problem wasn't a political disagreement that could be negotiated. It was a structural incompatibility that could only be resolved by one system defeating the other. The Southern elite understood this perhaps better than anyone. That's why they were so fiercely protective of slavery's right to expand. They knew that containment meant extinction. They knew that a permanently free state majority in Congress would eventually come for their property, their power, and their way of life. And they were willing to destroy the Union rather than accept that future. What makes this story so haunting is how deeply the financial system was implicated in every stage of the crisis. The enslaved were not just laborers. They were financial assets used as collateral for loans, securitized through mortgage instruments, and traded on domestic markets that functioned with the cold efficiency of modern commodity exchanges. Southern banks developed entirely new financial innovations to accommodate the slave economy. They created mortgage-backed instruments in which human beings were the underlying asset decades before Wall Street would create the mortgage-backed securities that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. The comparison is not exact, but the underlying logic is disturbingly similar. A financial system that treated a morally indefensible asset as the foundation of economic stability and then collapsed when the contradiction could no longer be sustained. Northern financial institutions were deeply implicated as well. They provided trade finance for slave-grown crops. They underwrote the shipping of cotton from Southern ports to European mills. They extended credit to Southern factors and commission merchants who serviced the plantation economy. Even insurance companies in the North wrote policies on enslaved people, treating them as property to be insured against loss. The entire financial system of the United States was, to one degree or another, built on the labor and bodies of enslaved African Americans. When war eventually came, the economic dimensions of the conflict determined its outcome almost as much as the military ones. The North had 23 million people. The South had 9 million, of whom nearly 4 million were enslaved and denied the ability to serve as soldiers at least until the final desperate months of the war. The North had most of the nation's railroad mileage, most of its manufacturing capacity, and most of its financial infrastructure. The South had cotton, courage, and a deep conviction that its cause was just. In a short war, Confederate advantages in military leadership and defensive geography might have prevailed, but in a long war, the North's industrial and demographic superiority was overwhelming, and the war was long. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted, its economy shattered, its infrastructure destroyed, and its labor system dismantled. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December of that year, formally abolished slavery throughout the United States, eliminating at a stroke what had been the nation's largest single financial asset. It was the most radical act of expropriation in American history, and arguably in the history of the modern world. $3. $5 billion in wealth simply eliminated without compensation. No other country in the Western Hemisphere ended slavery through such a cataclysmic process. Britain had compensated its slaveholders when it abolished slavery in 1833. France had done the same. In the United States, the slaveholders' compensation was defeat on the battlefield. And here's the final thing I think historians get wrong, or at least fail to emphasize sufficiently. The Civil War didn't just end slavery, it transformed the structure of the American state. Before the war, the United States was often described as a loose confederation, a federation of sovereign states in which the federal government was relatively weak. After the war, it emerged as a fundamentally different kind of entity, a centralized national state with the power to levy income taxes, conscript soldiers, issue a national currency, and enforce its laws with overwhelming military force. The war didn't just resolve the slavery question, it resolved the fundamental question of American governance. The United States would be a nation, not a collection of states. Federal authority would be supreme, and the democratic principle that a minority cannot veto the will of the majority through secession would be established in blood. The economic consequences were equally transformative. With the Southern planter class defeated and the slave economy destroyed, The way was cleared for the rapid industrialization of the United States. The Homestead Act opened the West to free labor settlement. The Pacific Railroad Acts authorized the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. The Morrill Act established the land-grant university system. The National Banking Acts created a unified national currency and banking system. These were all measures that had been blocked by Southern opposition before the war. With the South out of Congress, they passed almost immediately. The Civil War didn't just free 4 million people. It unleashed the forces that would transform the United States from an agricultural republic into an industrial superpower. But the human cost was staggering in scale. 620,000 dead. Millions more wounded, displaced, and traumatized. Entire cities burned. An agricultural economy devastated. And for the 4 million newly freed Americans, emancipation was only the beginning of a struggle for genuine equality that continues to this day. The promises of Reconstruction were systematically betrayed. The wealth that had been stolen from generations of enslaved laborers was never returned. The racial caste system that slavery had created was reconstructed in new forms through black codes, convict leasing, sharecropping, segregation, and a century of state-sanctioned violence and discrimination. So, when we ask what historians get wrong about the Civil War, I think the answer is this. The problem is not necessarily that the individual facts are wrong. The problem is how those facts are assembled into a story. They present it as a conflict about one thing, slavery, or alternatively about another thing, states' rights, when in reality it was about the total structure of American life. It was about who would control the economy, who would control the government, who would control the territories, and who would define the meaning of freedom in the most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was the fulcrum around which all of these questions turned, but the forces in play were economic, political, diplomatic, constitutional, and ideological all at once, all intertwined and all pointing toward a collision that no compromise could prevent. The Civil War was not simply an accident, nor can it be reduced to a failure of leadership. It was the inevitable consequence of building a nation on a foundation that was morally indefensible and economically unsustainable. The tragedy is that it took the deaths of 620,000 people to resolve a contradiction that the founders embedded in the Constitution in 1787 when they counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of representation and then looked away. The echoes of that original sin are still with us. The wealth that was extracted from enslaved labor over 2.5 centuries was never returned. The racial hierarchies that slavery created were never fully dismantled, and the economic disparities that the plantation system produced continue to shape American life in ways that we are only now beginning to fully understand. If there is a broader lesson in all of this, it's that the origins of major conflicts are rarely simple. They are layered, structural, and deeply rooted in the economic arrangements that we build our societies upon. The American Civil War wasn't just a war over slavery. It was a war over the kind of capitalism America would practice, the kind of democracy it would build, and the kind of nation it would become. In that sense, the story and its consequences are not entirely finished. If you found this deep dive valuable, I'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might think, and it means these kinds of in-depth stories keep getting made. I will see you in the next video.